Is calculating with Sig Figs. Now, remember, yesterday we saw a video that explained what Sig Figs are. And so Sig Figs really apply to all numbers that we see in chemistry. And so, as it turns out, there's rules for how we have to round numbers based on the number of Sig Figs that are there for each individual number, as well as whether or not we're adding or subtracting or multiplying or dividing. And so the rules are different when we're talking about addition and subtraction versus multiplication and division. And so let's first start off with our addition and subtraction rule. And so this rule says that as we're doing this, we need to look at the decimal portion of the number. And then after we look at the decimal portion, we count the number of digits to the right of the decimal. And so we do that for each of our numbers in the problem. Then as we go through, we add or subtract like normal, but we round our answer, like our final answer, to the least number of decimal places. And so what that means is if we're looking at like our first example here, we have 42.5612 minus 34.960. Now when we plug this into our calculator, we plug this in just like normal. And so when we do, we end up getting 7.6012. And so now let's look at how we have to round based on Sig Figs. So our first number here has 4 Sig Figs after the decimal place, while our 34.960 only has 3. So because there's 3 in this number, that means we have to round our final answer to 3 decimal places. So that means we're going to keep the 6, the 0, and the 1, and then we look at the next number to see if it rounds up or down. So remember, if it's 5 or up, it's going to round our final answer. So in this case, the 1, it would round up. However, if it's less than 5, then we don't change that final number. So it would round down. And so in this case, we get 7.601. Now, just a side note, when we're talking about rounding, let's just say we get a number that is something like, I don't know, 5.5349. And this is the spot that we're looking at. Just so you guys know, we only look at the next digit. So we don't continue looking. It could be 4.99999 continuing. It doesn't matter, but we are only looking at the 4. So that's the cutoff. And since 4 is less than 5, it just stays as 5.53. So just a side note that when we're looking at it, you have to mark your cutoff, and that's where you round. All right, let's look at our next example. So we have 5.325 plus 7.21 plus 10.0231. And so when we plug all of this into our calculator, we get 22.5581. Now let's look at our digits, meaning our decimal places. And so in our first number, we have 3 after the decimal place. In our next number, we have 2 after the decimal place. And then in our last number, we have 4 after the decimal place. So now as we're looking at this, because 2 is the lowest, that means our final answer here should round to 2 decimal places. So that means that we're going to keep the first 2 decimal places. There's our cutoff line. And now we look at the 8. And since the 8 is going to round up, that means our final answer here becomes 22.56. All right, so that's it for our addition and subtraction rules. Now let's talk about the rules for multiplication and division. Now these rules are much easier overall. For these, you just count the number of significant figures, or the total number of significant figures of all the numbers involved in the problem. Then you multiply or divide in normal fashion, meaning we just multiply or divide how we normally would. And we round our answers so that way it has the same number of significant figures as the number with the lowest amount of sig figs or significant figures. And so as we're looking at that, let's kind of go through. And so we have 29.35 times 1.2. And so when we plug this into our calculator, we end up getting the answer 35.22. And now let's look at our sig figs. So in our first number, the 29.35, there are 4 sig figs. And then in 1.2, there are 2 sig figs. So we're going to round to 2 sig figs because that's the number that has the fewest or the lowest number of sig figs. So that means 35.22 just becomes 35. All right, let's look at our next one. So we have 56.32 divided by 4.52. And when we plug this into our calculator, we end up getting 12.460177. And so as we're rounding, let's look. Our first number, 56.32, has 4 sig figs, and 4.52 has 3. So in this example, we need to round to 3 sig figs. And so as we're rounding to 3 sig figs, that means that we'll just draw a little cutoff line here. Our cutoff line is between the 4 and the 6. And so the 6 is going to cause the 4 to round up. So that gives us 12.5 as our final answer. All right, and now let's look at just one more example. And this one actually is a little bit more complex because it has both addition and subtraction. Well, it has subtraction and it has division in it. And so for this, we have to follow our sig fig rules while we're completing the order of operations. So that means our first step should be, according to the order of operations, the 45.456 minus 2.89. And so that gives us our answer of 42.566. Now, since this is subtraction, remember it goes by the fewest number of decimal places. So in this case, the 2.89 only has 2 decimal places. So our answer on the top should only have 2 decimal places, which means that this becomes 42.57. And now we continue our problem with the divided by 22.3 part. And so now we divide our answer by 22.3. And keep in mind, it should be the 42.57. You cannot just do the answer part on your calculator. So we do have to restart and type in the 42.57. You can't use the 42.566. So now when we type this in and we plug it into our calculator, we end up getting 1.90896. And then let's say 9 again. And so now we round based on our multiplication and division rule, which says the fewest number of sig figs. So since 22.3 only has 3 sig figs, that means our final answer here should only have 3 sig figs. So the 1, the 9, and the 0 are being kept. And then we look at the 8. And of course, the 8 causes the 0 to round up. So our final answer here should be 1.91. All right, that's it for our sig fig rules. So go ahead and give the rest of it an attempt on your own. Now it is broken up by the type. And so it does have adding and subtracting as its own set. So give your calculator answer. So you can write the full answer that your calculator gives you, and then do the rounded answer according to sig figs, according to the sig fig rules. All right, that's it for this video. I'll see you guys on the next one.